If Frieren the character is meant to show us the heights of magic, then perhaps Frieren's show is meant to show us the heights of production consistency. Yeah, that was pretty corny. Half joking, but follow me here. Frieren Beyond Journey's End, episode after episode for 28 episodes straight on a seasonal anime schedule beginning with a batch of 4 episodes, still managed to simply always look the way it's supposed to. I realize this may sound like damning with faint praise in a sense, but in the age of Sakuga slumps, production meltdowns, regular seasonal delays, and of course shows that are incredibly impressive but also feature many holes and inconsistencies in their production, this is highly praiseworthy, and it of course isn't where the praise ends. There are no obvious holes in Frieren, at least in terms of production quality. Frieren doesn't have intrusive or distracting CG. It doesn't feature any 3D dragons, 3D horses, 3D carriages, core-cast 3D backup models, at least that I noticed, or any of those crowds full of vomit-inducing 3D background characters, which somehow even reared their ugly heads in the final Attack on Titan specials. Seriously, when did this become an acceptable look in what is otherwise a beautiful production? When did this become an acceptable look outside of generic light novel adaptations? I'm sure a lot of the magic in Frieren probably was CG, and obviously there's always going to be CG compositing present throughout, but whatever CG was there, it was never distracting, even to someone like me whose spider senses start tingling basically anytime the common culprits show up on screen. When I did actively notice the likely CG elements, it was usually also just kind of praiseworthy. What I can only assume were 3D cameras moving through environments full of 2D assets, for example, a technique I really appreciated in both Heavenly Delusion and early episodes of Chainsaw Man as well, or the wonderfully dynamic parallax camera effects revealing hidden layers of details, or warping and wrapping around subjects, something which should, by all rights, be a part of every production in an age where we all have access to programs that utilize digital layers. I mean, honestly, when is there any reason in the modern era not to use these tools when they're so powerful and relatively simple to implement? They can really upgrade what is a very standard production to something that takes advantage of the way that it can use independent layers, and personally I think pretty much every production should be using that to its advantage, but that's just me. Now, there may not be literally dozens of mind-bendingly ambitious multi-minute peak cinema action scenes a la JJK Season 2 in Frieren, but there are a decent few of them, all polished to damn near perfection in this case, and literally every episode has at least a few moments that just dazzle. But perhaps most importantly, there really just weren't any bad moments where I could feel the production truly slipping. To illustrate what I mean, I'm not sure there was anything in this series quite as unimaginably ambitious as the Sukuna versus Maharaja fight, with all those brilliant cuts by folks like Vincent Chancer assaulting our eyeballs in the best possible ways for entire episodes at a time, but imagine if all that flash and flare had the same level of polish that was present in literally every single episode of Frieren. Speaking of Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2, there were no moments in Frieren where I stopped and thought, oh, yeah, the compositing was a little heavy-handed or unfinished looking there, or, oh, yeah, the background colors and foreground colors just don't quite look fully polished or like they, belong in the same environment, given the way that things are colored. No, everything from the art style to the direction to the animation to the compositing to the color grading just looks as it should. No matter what might be happening on screen, every scene and every moment of the show always looks somewhere between above average and masterful, with a beyond enviable level of consistent polish, which never left me saying, well, that was really impressive, but I sure hope they fix this element or that element in the Blu-ray. What would they fix? But it's not just the polish that's worth bragging about, of course. The show features all those gorgeous parallax camera effects and good uses of CG that I mentioned before. It features not just quick and decisive yet wonderfully dynamic action scenes, but a wild range of tones with some of the most relaxing scenes around as well, all illustrated poignantly through the audio-visual experience. It consistently included wonderful montages without any need for dialogue, as well as wonderful character acting, sometimes hauntingly serious, sometimes absolute peak visual comedy. And those freaking backgrounds, man. Even when they show up for a moment, blurred out in the background of a fight scene that's kind of flying by, they're usually painterly, consistent, incredibly detailed, polished, and just do a great job of ingratiating you to the beauty of the environments and the world building. Every episode feels brisk yet relaxed, quote-unquote slow-paced, even though essentially every episode features not just one, but two key plot lines, which almost always resolve cathartically within that one episode. And fascinating that the show pulls off that strange sense of ironic pacing in a series which is all about the perception of time, but let's not get lost on that. The music sounds great, while blending with the show effortlessly, an effect which, at its most impressive, I think is in large part due to the fact that the first 4 episodes were actually pre-scored, scored with unique music written for unique moments and unique scenes, a technique which was implemented strategically on occasion as the series continued for the long term. But not only does the music sound great, the sound design, the ambience, the Foley nature sounds and the like also sounded really great, and were ever present throughout the entire season. And with all this going on in a seasonal series, it's impossible to ignore perhaps the most impressive part. That is, once again, to say that this basically all persisted from start to finish on a seasonal schedule for 28 episodes straight. And not only is everything of consistent quality, but completely cohesive as a whole package. Now, I'm not the first to say it, but I do think that this can in large part be credited to producer Fukushi and director Keiichiro Saito, who made his directorial debut on Bocchi the Rock, a show which featured tons of strange mixed media presentation choices and a wide range of ping-ponging emotions while also retaining that cohesive feel and identity. This guy's obviously going places. Once again, not the first to say it, but obviously. And this is not all to imply that I have literally no issues with the season. I'll admit that the second or third time they cut from a flashback of Himmel to someone else saying verbatim what he had just said to, kind of reflect the flashback in the present day, I was really starting to feel like they were laying it on extra thick. Like, am I suddenly back to watching a typical cheesy shonen where they try to get away with a you get one kind of moment multiple times over the course of a single season? That did kind of grate on me at times, but every single time, 30 seconds later, I'm just lulled back into a state of ease, unable to find anything else for my jaded nitpicking instincts to latch onto. And sure, if you're not down with the slice of life vibes, then the show probably won't be for you in the long term, and that's fine. If you're not into the subtle and subdued approach to tragedy, what I called unceremonious tragedy in my first video, then maybe the show simply won't be for you. If you came here specifically for a shonen action experience, perhaps you won't appreciate the quick and decisive battle sequences that many of us often actually find quite refreshing, as opposed to something like JJK or Solo Leveling. Or on the opposite end of the spectrum, if Frieren's version of a tournament arc simply not having as much thematic depth as the opening arc's analysis of the perception of time and coming to terms with death, or the following arc's bold approach to the demons and their black and white, evil, sociopathic, definitionally inhuman tendencies, if the equivalent of a tournament arc not matching that same thematic depth is enough to do the show in for you, maybe your expectations with the show's intellectual content will simply continue to be let down over time based on how strongly the show opened on that front. There could be any number of reasons that the show simply might not cater to the specific appeals that you're seeking, especially if you're coming to the show just because it's a well-animated shonen, or for, any other number of reasons, but setting the most subjective of personal tastes and storytelling nitpicks aside, I'm not sure that there was really anything truly worth complaining about with this 2-core consecutive odd episode count show, and I'm just floored by that happening in 2024. I'm also blown away looking at it and imagining how any number of shows could have looked and felt with this level of consistent polish and lack of distracting elements. JJK Season 2 and Demon Slayer are obviously the first ones that come to mind, but I remember hearing so many people say when Chainsaw Man was initially airing, "Oh, what I would give for my favorite manga to get an adaptation like this." No. What I would give for my favorite manga to get an adaptation like Frieren, baby. What's truly crazy is, contrary to popular belief, the show didn't have some insane 2-year-long pre-production phase, a la Dragon Ball Daima, and or a miraculously lax, staff-friendly working environment, a la all the big Kyoto animation shows. It allegedly had a relatively normal, arguably fairly busy production. The series was actually in pre-production as Bocchi the Rock, a damn ambitious work in its own right, was still airing. And as I mentioned earlier, they of course featured the same overall series director. So obviously, there was a point in the production of this show where not everyone was on board. What it did have working in its favor were mostly unheard of connections and corporate backing for a seasonal anime. Both Toho and Aniplex sit on the series' production company, both massive production companies, obviously. It opened with a brilliant 4-episode premiere on a mainstream movie network, usually reserved for the likes of Ghibli movies. And to quote Kevin over on SakugaBlog to sort of expound upon that point, I quote, "To be more precise, let's first delve into how these first episodes were broadcast, because those are some important details as well. Although streaming platforms have gotten the first 4 episodes of the series separately, they first aired together in NTV's prestigious Friday Roadshow slot, which is to say the type of nationwide mainstream platform that TV anime is rarely granted. While animated works do earn that honor sometimes, shout out to the Minions movie that will follow up Frieren this week, it's quite rare to see anime in there, other than iconic films such as Ghibli's works. Another recent exception to the norm would be Violent Evergarden, which took over the slot for multiple weeks and at one point had the TV show re-edited to fit its length. What makes that even more relevant, as you might have already guessed, is that Frieren's composer Evan Call was appointed because people like Taguchi were fond of his work on that series." End quote. For now. This all of course got it big exposure early on and likely only further greased the gears to get even more people excited to work on it. Whether that's upcoming talent or industry veterans usually reserved for movie level productions, a la Studio Ghibli or Makoto Shinkai. This is also not only thanks to exposure on a channel typically reserved for movies and more mainstream programs, but also thanks to one of the show's many producers, Takashi Nakame, who also worked as producer on theatrical works, Garden of Words, and Your Name, alongside director Makoto Shinkai. Once again, leading to all the more potential connections within the production. The show had competent management and delegation in both production, Studio Madhouse's Fukushi line of production led by Yuichiro Fukushi, and obviously competent direction, once again by the same man who brought us Bocchi, Keiichiro Saito. So, industry connections, a unique broadcasting situation, tons of wonderful individual artists who were happy to sign on when they saw who all was present and how things were going already, ingenious solutions to the issues all too common in anime production, and, I mean, hopefully a slightly better than average work environment, but I don't think that any of us really know that one way or another. And yet, the final product looks like this. And because I see little point in attempting to put it better myself, I'm going to finish out the video with another admittedly lengthy excerpt from one of Kevin's write-ups over on SakugaBlog, which is freely available just for the record, although I do send them a whopping $1 a month on Patreon. But anyway, this is an excerpt from a blog entry entitled "Resourcefulness Reigns Supreme. Frieren Beyond Journey's End, Production Notes 5 through 10. I quote, "While fans tend to think about production circumstances as black and white, Frieren exemplifies what success tends to look like in the real world, a result of resourceful management, delegation of the right tasks to the right people, and ingenious solutions to tricky situations. It's not a secret that the internet hates nuance as much as it loves false dichotomies. Recent events have been brewing a myopic discourse around anime production, where the two popular titles of the moment must necessarily represent opposite ends of a black and white situation. If Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 is such a poorly planned project, then Frieren must be in a thoroughly blessed situation. Hence why its adaptation is so beautiful. We've written at length about the dangers of making such assumptions about perceived quality and labor conditions as a viewer, and even the fact that corporations exploit that opacity to whitewash their dubious management. So it shouldn't be a surprise that neither case is so absolute. Even though the schedule was never favorable in the least, JJK Season 2's team has still put together some stunning, fully realized work, especially in its first arc. And despite that being the norm for all of Frieren thus far, assuming that this is directly a consequence of having ample time and a comfortable environment at their disposal is a mistake. People should be more careful about suddenly painting Studio Madhouse as a healthy workplace simply because they want to contrast that with MAPPA, because we're still talking about the same company that just a few years ago kicked off the trend of being sued for egregious treatment of their management staff. Extrapolating the reality of the studio as a whole from their treatment of Yuichiro Fukushi's production line is also a misstep, as their status as the studio's stars earns them an entirely different level of resources and staff availability. Even if we look within that one crew, the situation can fluctuate quite a lot. For some recent examples involving many people currently working on Frieren, look no further than the deep troubles their production assistant expressed when managing their episode of Spy Family Season 1, or how exhausted a bunch of them were after the late move from Sunny Boy to Tact Op Destiny. By assuming that their success is a given due to positive circumstances, you're not only turning a blind eye to their occasionally severe struggles, but also can entirely miss how that success happened. This is all quite relevant to Frieren, as many of its triumphs are instead a showcase of savviness and efficient technique. In our first piece covering the series, we already went through the genesis of the project, and for as impressive as it is to convince Toho producers that they want to turn your work into an anime after a single chapter, that was still in 2020, so much time had to pass to accumulate enough material to seriously approach the idea. The time constraints that surround this project on many levels are hardly an industry secret. Even though Saito was obviously entrusted with the series before the broadcast of Bocchi the Rock 1 year ago, he was still quite busy with that up to the end of its run, which conditioned the progress for Frieren. In the official starting guide for the anime, his interview alongside character designer Reiko Nagasawa and series composer Tomohiro Suzuki indirectly gave some hints about how tight its pre-production process was. Nagasawa explained that she based her designs on the then current state of the manga, as styles tend to change notably during the early points of serializations before stabilizing. She specifically singled out up to volume 7 of the manga, which is to say a spring 2022 release for this early stage of the design process where she had to decide on the style to follow. Having personally seen different types of design materials, color scripts, artboards, and the likes, being given the final okay between the fall and winter of that year, that about tracks to a production process that did start in 2022, but has only kicked out in full as the series director himself became free from previous obligations. And for a very ambitious 2-core anime, that means they've had no time to spare. What has made it so different from other titles in similarly tight situations then? A variety of reasons, including the exceptionally high floor when it comes to technique. Frieren has the magnetism of not just a beloved young director who just put out a mega hit, but 2-star animation producers. Everyone on the outside is giving credit to Fukushi, while often forgetting that Takashi Nakame is using his theatrical experience and ampler freedom as the second-in-command to cherry-pick star guests that would normally never be available to TV anime. Not exactly a hyperbole, as he's responsible for the presence of Ghibli-aligned animators who hadn't stepped on TV for multiple decades, and it's not just those who make a difference. Given that tremendous pull, this team has been able to be picky with all of its participants, which is exactly the opposite of the industry trend to hire the first person you see out of sheer desperation. Be it reliable veterans or youngsters who have proven that they can navigate the often obtuse production process, you can save so much time and trouble simply by building a team that will minimize the constant corrections to people's work. If you add that general aptitude to minute but still very impactful specific moves, you can produce a series that punches way above its weight. One obvious example that I keep returning to is the pre-scoring, which they did apply across the entirety of the special 4-episode introduction to give it a special feel, and is now being tactically deployed to much success. Without entirely changing the normal workflow, a team this resourceful can still send individual animators a recording of the track planned for that particular scene. This often results in sequences that don't just capture the feelings implied by the storyboard and script, but can match the intended tone on a whole different level through that synchronicity with the audio. Knowing when to pull off this stunt and who to entrust these moments to are also part of Frieren's specific recipe for success. And that brings us back to Saito specifically, because one of his greatest feats in this project has been the delegation of tasks. As someone who was very busy in the early stages of the production, he simply had to find reliable members in the team to set the foundations for the adaptation he'd envisioned. As we also discussed in the first Frieren article, one of the most significant cases of this is Seiko Yoshioka, whose various credits as a concept artist and the likes fall short of explaining her massive role in the world-building process. Due to that packed schedule and his struggle to convey everything verbally, Saito exposed the cornerstones of his vision and gave her room to imagine Frieren's entire world in societies far beyond the confines of the original manga, tying it all together with their relationship to the passage of time. Be it the color scripts to set specific moods, extensive design work to solidify the customs of the people in Frieren's world, or the many season/age variants for all she paints to underline that overarching theme, the presence of people like Yoshioka made the job easier for everyone else, from a director who could sigh in relief to all the staff members who came later and were presented with clear, tangible goals. End quote. The article is a good bit longer, and I would encourage you to give it a read if you're interested. It's a good one. It is. Above all, I'd just love to give a huge shout out and thanks to Kevin and all the wonderful folks at SakugaBlog for injecting some quality and accessible information into the Western world. The main pull of the article is of course the importance of resourcefulness, but I think it's also a reminder that as awesome as artistic skills and hard work are, ingenuity, the real life power of friendship, aka connections, and even a little bit of that business savvy mindset in resourceful management, delegation of tasks, established industry connections, etc. can go a long way when used to help foster that great art. Allegedly. Anyway, I'm not gonna drag this one out any longer. I just wanted to brag about Frieren, the staff, production team, and director for a few minutes. I do have a little bullet point list I've been putting together for a little Beyond First Impressions retrospective of sorts, which will obviously have more to do with the story and, maybe a couple of comparisons to Dungeon Meshi and some of the discussion around the two. But if you haven't seen it already, I also made this First Impressions video, which people seem to really like a lot. It's one of my most highly viewed videos, so maybe check it out if you haven't already. But anyway, that's enough YouTuber speak. Very cringe. Hope you have a good day wherever you are.